Is reading the only way to study a story? No. I love
No, it's absolutely not. I'm Randall Allen Dunn, thriller writer. I write fantasy and action thrillers that read like blockbuster movies. And this statement that's being made is by a writing coach who's just pointing out the fact that most writers are told that if you want to write, you have to read. Well, yes, you do have to read. And actually, I would say if you're a writer, you should also watch TV, watch a play, listen to radio dramas, watch movies, all those things. You should experience storytelling in different forms, including just listening to somebody tell you a story, because you need to know how stories work. Also, if you're going to write books, you need to read books so that you know how it's structured and how it works. However, that doesn't mean that in order to write a lot of books or write them well, you need to read a lot of stories. You should be fairly well read. You should learn some things about writing, but you also need to understand that's not the only absolute way to learn how to tell stories well or how to write well. Honestly, you could read 5 or 10 good books that are well written and start writing, develop your style, and then learn a lot of other storytelling techniques from other sources. I grew up reading comic books and watching movies and TV, and those are the stories that stuck with me that were very impactful that I still remember to this day. Now, as of today, I am fairly well read. I've read a lot of classic literature because I wanted to find out what is it about these classic stories that made them endure and what parts of them endured. Because some things, if you look at some classics today like Moby Dick, an editor would cut that in half in no time. It's just a lot of unnecessary information in that book. It just is. Because people wrote differently in different centuries and in different decades, even. The way that a book was written back in the 70s for a thriller is nothing like you would write a thriller today. So, keeping that in mind, there are different ways to tell a story, there are different ways to write, and you do need to be familiar with books, but you need to be aware of how you need to tell a story, of who you are and what works for you. For me, what I have found is that a lot of the ways that many novelists would tell stories didn't really work well for me. Even today, there are a lot of times where I try hard to get into a novel and I just can't, and it's because of the way it's written. It's because it's not written in a way that has things happening. So, although I write stories that are structured more like a movie where you have things happening regularly, throughout the story, that may sound superficial and taking an easy route. But the fact is, the filmmakers follow classic storytelling techniques like what you would have had in things like Moby Dick or Treasure Island or A Tale of Two Cities. Classic literature that says, show, don't tell. Use symbolism for character names and for places. So use symbolic events happening that reflect what's going on in the theme of the story. You make the setting of your story, treat it like a character. For example, in the movie The Fugitive, Harrison Ford said, we need to set this in the city of Chicago. It's a perfect place to represent the theme of somebody who gets lost in society. Chicago feels like that. There's also things with foreshadowing. There are things of having structured character relationships, like the triangular relationship between Kirk and Spock and McCoy on the TV series Star Trek. It's similar to the relationship between Harry Potter and Hermione and Ron. Harry has a little bit of Ron in him where he wants to just be a normal kid and goof off. He's also got a little bit of Hermione in him where he realizes he has big responsibilities and he needs to take them seriously and work hard. And so you'll see sometimes he's a little bit of both. Even more so in the original Star Trek, the character relationship between Kirk, Spock, and McCoy was that Spock and McCoy would offer alternative, uh, opposing arguments of a situation, and Kirk would simply look back and forth between them and listen. And those two opposing voices represented the internal struggle he was having in making a decision. He had to think logically and he had to think emotionally and had to weigh the consequences of each of those things to make his decision. It was a brilliant way of portraying characters. All those structural things that people put into building a story for film or TV or even a comic book, those are things that are very specific and very, very tested, proven classical storytelling techniques that worked for Charles Dickens, worked for H.G. Wells, worked for lots of people for lots of years, and we're still reading their stories today. And some of the movies and TV series that I grew up on that were really effective are still really popular today, like 50 years later. So that is how I write. You need to find what works for you. If you are finding that comic books are, the structure of a comic book story is really how you want to write a story and you want to write more pulp fiction, which is kind of the kind of story I write, then great. Get familiar with comic books. If you need to read more, if you need to watch more movies, get into westerns, get into, 1950s science fiction stories, whatever it is that works for for feeding you the information you need to craft the stories you are trying to craft, do that. It doesn't have to be books. And in fact, there are some books, I don't care how successful they are, there are some books you should really avoid doing what they do. Because all those classic storytelling techniques I listed of show, don't tell, use symbolism, there are lots of best-selling novelists that don't do those things every time. Sometimes you read some of their books and it's like, they're actually not doing it correctly in the way they're telling this story. And if you're an experienced writer, you can pick out some of those things. But just be aware that we all make mistakes. We all fail at different times. But just with the way a movie is structured, they have no choice but to show, not tell. They have no choice but to use symbolism and other things that present information in a way that doesn't stop the story. Because if they do what some best-selling novelists might do, where they take pages and pages to describe how a dystopian society got to be the way it is, or if they take pages and pages to describe a romantic heroine's backstory and how she grew up in the South and how she was never able to attend college and on and on and on, without anything actually happening, with no dialogue, no activity. If you try to put that in a movie, people walk out. Why? Because nothing is happening in the story. And that's why I have a really hard time reading some novels, because it takes too much time of nothing happening in a story. So that's how I write. Determine for yourself what you need to feed yourself fuel for your own writing. And if you want to read stories that read more like a movie, that have things happening all the time, that have action or drama going in every chapter, that have memorable characters and cool action scenes and dialogue, then check out some of my work. But thank you for watching. Keep believing.